We're live. We're here to chat about photo stuff. Greg, Eric,
Yeah.
nice to have you here. We're starting at around
Hey,
11
everybody.
o'clock.
am here.
This was the time we
Yeah,
used to always stream because I used to live in California.
that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's been a while since we recorded an episode of the podcast and want to try to do that. So
Let's
that's
go.
that's what we're going to do with that in mind. Yeah. People
Hell
ready?
yeah. I'm ready.
I'm ready.
Hello everybody and welcome to Dragged into Turbolasers, a miniature wargaming podcast from the people behind the blog Between the Bolter and Me. I'm your host Eric Wire and I'm here with my two brothers Adam Wire
Hey, everybody.
and Greg Wire.
Hey, everyone.
Yeah, well, it's good to be here. I feel it's been a little while since we recorded an episode of the podcast. Perhaps since Adepticon, which
Yeah, I
already
mean,
seems like ages
it's hard
ago.
to find time to do the things.
Yeah, I think I don't know, things have life has, I don't know, gotten in the way of things and just
As
been
it does.
stretched here or there from work and other things. But I guess during that time, I've become increasingly more excited about photography. And this is something that I have recently had a post about it online and have been just on our Instagram posting photos and stuff I've been taking. And much of this was spawned from being gifted a few film cameras from our grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And I, up until that point, had basically only shot photos digitally with like in high school and a while back with kind of cheap point and shoot cameras and
Yeah.
then more recently with like phone cameras and then mirrorless cameras and so forth. But the process of trying to shoot with film helped change my perspective a little bit and think more about the craft of photography, and that has been very exciting. And I think it all honestly has been something that I've slowly gotten more interested over the past few years with the blog and so forth. But film really energized that. And with that in mind, I thought it would be fun here to talk a little bit about miniature photography, how I got here, some of the, I don't know, pitfalls and things along the way, and maybe provide some insight or thoughts for people to think about when they're trying to attempt photography, particularly of their miniatures in this hobby, but just also in general, whether that's digital or through film. But I think in general, photography is very important in this hobby, primarily just because it's a way to share what you're doing with the world. If you have an Instagram account, or in our case, a blog or something, the way you project that and get people interested in it and share what you're doing is through, taking pictures of the models you're building, converting, and painting, and so forth. And the better you can do that, the more you can get other people excited about it, and just the better you can document what you're doing accurately to portray to others and that sort of thing. But I guess with everything else, the more you get into something, the more you realize how deep and expansive it can be. And photography, I think, is something that is pretty daunting, and there's a lot to learn to become proficient at it. And certainly at this point, I hardly even would consider myself a photographer, but I feel I've learned a lot. And yeah, just wanted to talk about it because of that. And I think anyone who's followed our blog for any length of time, I think could see that our photography skills have changed a lot over the years,
They sure
particularly
have.
the like 12 or so years ago when we started. our photos are pretty bad. Um, I still think we were always at least somewhat mindful of wanting good photos, but didn't really have the skill set or knowledge to necessarily do that. And also didn't necessarily have the cameras or things that would best facilitate that. Um,
Yeah, I sort
but
of feel like with most things, um, whenever you start really anything, you don't you have to start somewhere and you don't necessarily know what are, say, the most critical or important aspects you should focus on to like best achieve your goals. And
mhm.
I think particularly now that almost everybody has a smartphone and it has a decent camera, like it's very easy to, for the most part, get into the notion of miniature photography. And I think that in itself is a positive, but I I would argue that a lot of the cameras and stuff on smartphones, most of it's kind of hidden away in such a way that you really have no idea what's going on, and you don't necessarily have a good sense of what you could even do if you wanted to improve things.
Yeah, I think that
Well,
is a good point.
I was gonna say, to my feeling, if you're first getting into miniature photography and you're using your smartphone, it seems like one of the first things that you might do, and heck, I think it's one of the first things we did, was look into getting like a little light box for taking pictures of your miniatures such that the lighting's better and there's a good backdrop. And that um isn't really dealing with anything pertaining to the camera. It's getting the conditions better.
More suitable.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that's what we had done, or my remembrance of what we had
Yeah,
started to
it is.
do. And eventually, through that process, after a few years of using that, we maybe came to the notion that the cell phone wasn't a great choice for photographing
We do
models.
now.
Yeah, so I think it is an interesting thing, and there's always that old adage, like the best camera is the one you have with you, and that phones have made that a very salient point. That pretty much
Yeah.
now, like
Any
your life
camera is
revolves
better
around
than no
cell phone,
camera.
and you have it with your pocket, like you can take a photo of something, and that's amazing, and it puts relatively nice cameras in the hands of lots of people and gives you the opportunity to explore it, and that's amazing. And the vast majority of our blog's life, we were using cell phone cameras, and I think did a fine job of things, like, and still could do a good job, like, and I would certainly encourage people to continue to use phones, and like I certainly will, like it is very convenient. But I think phones, while making things much photography much more approachable in the quest for convenience and such, it has also caused like this progression towards more and more automation that essentially
Yeah.
allows you to detach from the act of photography and never really learn what is taking place and what goes into the process. It's just like point it and click a bunch of times, get a ton of shots, maybe never even look at them. And that detachment, I think, can be a detriment for you to learn how to get better at the craft. And while phones have pushed this perhaps to an extreme, it's something that has kind of always been present in cameras. Like some of the, I mean, and I'm certainly not like a historian on cameras and such, but like older cameras and like the one exacta film camera that I got from our grandfather, it it's 35 millimeter film. It has no light meter, no anything. You put the film in, you have to judge the lighting, determine what would be a good shutter speed and aperture to get a good shot. But then over time, years later, they started to add light meters inside cameras that allow you to better estimate that. And then they eventually add like auto exposure settings and auto aperture settings, and like more and more you eventually get to like point and shoot cameras and even modern mirrorless cameras that have all these automatic modes that can figure out all this stuff for you. And that's very convenient, speeds up things, but it does take you one step away from needing to learn what's happening and how it's happening, which can make it more difficult to learn because you might not have to.
Can
And
I jump in and say a thing
yeah.
that's maybe not quite related to that, but jumping back to the notion of the best camera is the one that you have with
Mhm.
you? I think that's largely true. Though I can say last evening I was at a concert, like a reunion concert for the hardcore band Weekend Nachos, and looking at the pictures that I took of that event, it almost makes me wish I took no pictures because they're awful. And there's something to be said about now if you go to a concert, it's just so many people with their phones out recording everything that
They're not
maybe it
even
would
in the
be
moment.
better. Yeah, maybe it would be better to put those away and just be in the moment.
Yeah, and I think with the speed of cameras and such, like you take just so like I heard a stat and it's like basically like 99% of all photographs in the world have been taken in the last 5 years or something to that effect.
That has to be true.
Um,
Like,
Yeah.
and that's
yeah.
Because
interesting. Even
everybody's a photographer now.
yeah,
Well, not really, but like everybody is taking photos now.
and even and I'll touch on this probably a little bit later. I've since been trying to take photos at some of the events we go to, like Adepticon, Under the Dice Fest, More Time 2019, things of that nature. And like I'll take hundreds and hundreds of photos and maybe save 100. Like it's so disposable,
Hmm.
and like you don't even often spend that much time to compose a shot. It's like I'll just shoot something. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'll fix it later. Or I'll pick out the good ones later. And film is inherently limiting in that
Hmm.
you have like 36 shots per roll of 35 millimeter film, and like you don't see the result immediately. You almost, by its very nature, have to slow down, and I think that can be helpful. But I'll touch on that a bit later, because I'd like to talk a bit more about how what pushed me to start to consider photography a little bit more and why I didn't feel the phone was doing the job I wanted it to.
Hmm.
And some of it was, as we've already talked about, all this automation that like there was, I almost felt like I didn't have any reason to learn. I would just click, click, like maybe get something okay. But I started to realize something that I think is pretty obvious, but phone cameras are not designed with miniature photography in mind.
Yeah.
Like these are cameras that are they're trying to get something that's small in a really small thing into a small phone and to be generally useful at capturing stuff most people do. Like they want to take pictures of their friends, of their pets, of like out the beach that they're at and stuff like this. They're designed to work generally in kind of everyday scenarios. They're like you can imagine that they didn't spend lots of effort to make these cameras be just perfect for taking pictures of tiny miniatures in like a battle scene or something. They're just not designed for that. There's a reason
Or of a
why.
bird, or of
Yeah.
a frog that you found in a pond. Like, they're
Or in a
pretty
concert
awful.
setting with poor lighting. Like they were designed to be kind of an all-rounder. But when you think about photographers, or if you look into photography at all, like people specialize in various things. Like they do portraiture, or they specifically do landscape, or they do like wildlife or bird photography or sports photography. And the reason why people tend to specialize is because like you need different equipment and lenses and knowledge and
Mm-hmm.
skills to do those well. So when thinking about your phone camera, they have multiple aspects that maybe aren't ideal for miniature photography. And I'll touch on them a little bit here, but again, I'm not really an expert in it per se. But I essentially would just notice that a lot of the pictures I would take, it would be difficult to get the miniatures completely in focus, and there'd be some computational stuff that's not that great. But one thing that is worth knowing, most of our phone cameras, they have a fixed aperture. So a lot of like more traditional photography lenses, you can change the aperture and change how much light is getting in through the lens to the sensor. So if it's completely open and all the glass is exposed, that is like wide open, but then you can close it down and let less light in. And for most phones, like that aperture, the amount of light that's left in is fixed. You can't change it. And
Mm-hmm.
most of them are designed such that the aperture is fixed and it's a pretty wide open aperture, or in this case, a low f-stop number, often like 1.8 or 2 or something. And those wide open apertures, they let in a lot of light, which is good, and particularly for a phone camera where you don't know the situation. You want to be able to let in a lot of light to deal with lower light photography. But inherent in a wide open aperture is that you have a very shallow depth of field. So what's in focus, the depth of what's in focus is very small. And this is exacerbated the closer you get to a subject, the shallower the depth of field is also as well. So if you have a very wide open aperture and try to get really close to have the
Mm.
miniature fill up the frame, what's in focus is very small. And because of that, you're trying to take a picture of a miniature like holding the sword out or something, and like you try to take a picture and maybe the head is in focus, but half the body isn't, the feet aren't, none of the gun is, and that doesn't look great. And it can be hard to deal with that, and just the nature of the physics and how it's constructed kind of work against that.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to that, um, most of the time when people talk about cameras and about focal lengths are like kind of like how zoomed the lens in is into a subject. A very common focal length when talking about just traditional cameras is 50 millimeters, like the nifty 50 lens. It used to be kind of the standard kit lens that you would have on a camera, and it's a focal length that's not that dissimilar to a human's field of view. And that was kind of often was a standard focal length. But most phone cameras, their main camera is much wider than that. Like for like the iPhone 15, its main camera, which iPhones and a lot of other phones will have like often have like upwards to 3 cameras,
Mm-hmm.
an ultra wide camera, the main camera, and a telephoto camera. But that main camera is often much wider than like the nifty 50. And admittedly, focal length, kind of in a lot of terms in photography, can be a bit confusing because it all depends on what your reference point is. But when talking about photography, it often comes back to 35 millimeter film. The 35 millimeter film picture is, 35 millimeters. And when digital cameras were made, most of the initial sensors were the sensor was made to be the size of film,
Mm-hmm.
and they ended up calling that a full frame sensor. And most of the times when people are referring to focal lengths, they're referring to that focal length in reference to that 35 millimeter film or a full frame sensor. So oftentimes when talking about cameras, they will say what its focal length is in full frame equivalents, because if the sensor is smaller than full frame, it affects all that. But all that's to say, I will try to talk about it in full frame equivalents so it's comparable. But so the iPhone's main camera, rather than being like a 55 millimeter focal length, so similar to your field of view, is like a 24 millimeter equivalent. So that's a wide angle lens. So it lets puts a lot of the image into view. The ultra wide is very wide at like for the iPhone 15 Pro Max is like a 13 millimeter full frame equivalent. I've never even shot on something so wide on like a mirrorless camera. Whereas then the telephoto lens, which is supposed to be like the really zoomed in sort of thing, that's only like 120 millimeters, which is a very short telephoto
Mm-hmm.
reach. Like I know, Adam, you do a bunch of bird photography stuff, and you shoot at mostly as
600?
like a 600 millimeter equivalent. So
Yeah.
120 millimeter for telephoto isn't really that zoomed in.
No.
But I guess I've kind of fallen down a rabbit hole here. But all of this is coming to say that the main sensor on your phone is likely more of a wide angle lens. And because of that, since it lets a lot of the scene into your picture, if you want your miniature to really fill up the screen, you have
Yeah.
to get really close to the miniature.
And you already said
Whereas if
that's not gonna work well for.
and whereas that can be fine, but the moment you get closer to a subject, that affects depth of field, but it also brings into perspective distortion. And
Mm-hmm.
this is something that you can, if you search online, you can see, like, you could search something to the effect of, like, what a person's face looks like at different focal
Mm.
lengths. And essentially, it's sort of a misnomer, but if you shoot something from a wide angle lens, it makes a person's face look really thin. But if you really zoom in, it makes them look very compressed and broad. And that's something called perspective distortion, and it's not really, it doesn't have anything to do with the focal length. It's actually based on how close you are to the subject. And for wide angle lenses, since they take such a wide shot, if you want like a miniature to take up the whole frame, you have to get really close. And you can imagine if you get up really close to something, it like completely takes up your field of view. And like a nose or something, as you get really close to a model or a face, the nose is super close to the lens, and it makes the nose look gigantic compared to everything else.
Yeah.
And all of this is to say, because of these wide angle lenses on cameras, it also makes, yeah, if you want to have the model fill up the frame, you have to get really close, which causes these perspective distortions, which doesn't necessarily always look great. So all of that's to say that while the phone camera can take nice photos, um, it's maybe not ideal for the job. And particularly because phones also do a lot of computational stuff kind of in the background, that also sometimes changes the image such that photos you take maybe don't really look that natural.
Yeah, so I
And
guess
most of the time,
yeah.
oh yeah, Adam, you can
I was
say
gonna say,
your
so the biggest, maybe it was like a few years ago, this is when I really noticed the limitations of the phone camera. was like I will often, when I'm painting a model, I will often take lots of pictures while I'm painting the model and then like send them to both of you and other friends. And part of the reason I'm doing that is one, to get opinions from other people, but two, it's like I'll send them and then I'll closely examine those photos to see, almost like get a magnified view of what I'm working on, to notice things that are maybe I should improve or change. And I distinctly remember when I got a newer phone, I noticed, particularly if I would ever like zoom in, use like the digital zoom on the camera and take a photo, I began to notice a lot of the details weren't accurately being represented to like what the actual model was. And I guess the closest thing I could liken it to would be almost like you have what your model actually looks like, and then you have this photo that you've taken that has sort of almost like taken the image and like cell shaded it, and like they've merged together different details and colors to make like a very weird looking representation of the model, such that you might see some weird little detail on like the model's face or something that isn't actually representing what the model actually looks like. So what I was trying to use the photos help me identify things that I should improve, and like it wasn't helping me do that. And I then essentially realized what I had to do was take never use the digital zoom and take a picture of the model further back and then just crop it down to what I actually cared about. And then it was more accurately representing what I was looking at. And so that sort of
Towards that
directly
end,
correlates to
yeah.
what you were talking about earlier, Eric.
And that is actually one thing that is often better with phone cameras for kind of the like, because cam or phones upgrade every year and they do all this stuff to try to encourage you to buy newer and newer phones. One thing for cameras, a lot of them have really high megapixel sensors.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because of that, that actually makes them pretty good at taking a photo and you just crop out all the shit you don't want. So
Mm-hmm.
to avoid this perspective distortion that I was talking about, like you don't really have to get super close to the model and introduce this perspective distortion. You can just stand back pretty far, take the photo, and then crop it all out. It's a high enough, like often they're like 50 megapixels, like the
Mm-hmm.
iPhones and Pixel ones. They're such a high megapixel that you can just crop the stuff out and it will likely be better because you can take it at like essentially a natural distance for your eye. You're not really close or really far away, which can either introduce um, like compression and some of those things. So yeah, that is something to consider if you are using a phone. You don't need to get up super close. Um,
And just for my clarification, the megapixel value is essentially the resolution.
yeah,
Well, yeah, and so
yeah,
like
that's
kind of
essentially what
getting
it is.
back to that, yeah, as I was saying earlier, I would notice if I would zoom in and take a picture, like maybe I would spend all this time to get like a nice color gradient from like a dark to a light color. And then when I would take this picture and like really look closely at it, it almost, instead of looking like a nice clear gradient, it would almost look like, oh, it's one color, then two color, then the third color. And it's like it was no longer a gradient because I think the phone like computationally tried to merge together stuff and almost like get a recreation of what I was looking at, which wasn't really accurate to what the model
Yeah, because
actually
I
looked
think
like.
phones, they probably that like they are doing a lot of computational stuff that like a lot of cases it's like even before you take the photo, it's taking shots such that when you press the shutter, it had some shots before and after you touch the shutter, such that they can computationally merge a bunch of photos
Mhm.
to get ideally a better photo out in the end, because like the lenses aren't that good. Like they can't be that good because they're so small. But if you merge all this stuff together, you can create a better image. And
Mhm.
oftentimes they will also do like focus and exposure bracketing, in which they will, one of the photos it takes will be severely overexposed, one will be underexposed, and one will be what it thinks is properly exposed. And then they will computationally average those together such that the really overexposed thing can add detail to the really dark areas, where the
Mhm.
underexposed thing can add detail to the lighter areas. So, like, together they can make a better image. And for kind of standard things like people and stuff, like it works pretty well and it results in much better looking images. But for this more specialized stuff, painting and smaller miniature stuff, it sometimes breaks down a little bit, particularly if you're trying to use it for learning or assist in painting and so forth. And
Mhm.
I also noticed a lot of these things, that a lot of the computational stuff that I felt I didn't have that much control over the phone for, because in a lot of like the Pixels phones and stuff, like there are very few controls in the camera
Yeah.
app. So like it just seems like a black box. So about 4 years ago, I decided, like, you know what? I didn't feel satisfied with the photos I was taking. Like they were fine, but I started to realize I was hitting up some of these limitations, and that led me to want to look into getting a camera that is like that's its focus.
Mhm.
And that kind of and this was, I guess, basically during COVID when everyone started a new hobby or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, I started to look into photography more and ended up at this time decide getting a Fujifilm X-T4, and it's a mirrorless camera, so it, like the name suggests, it's it doesn't have a mirror like a lot of older film cameras and such, were single lens reflex cameras that you'd kind of, the lens would let in light and there would be a mirror that would reflect that image up into a viewfinder, so you would literally be looking through the lens to see what the image was. In mirrorless cameras, they don't have a mirror like that. There's just a digital projection of what you're looking at. But because of not needing a mirror that flips up when you take a photo and such, they can make them smaller. And that's a big thing why people like mirrorless cameras, is they tend to just be smaller than digital single reflex lens cameras. But regardless, I decided to get a mirrorless camera, and I ended up selecting a Fujifilm camera, which Fujifilm is a fairly legendary name in the film world, alongside, I guess, Kodak. They're two of the large brands that made lots of different film stock over the years. And Fujifilm, when making digital mirrorless cameras, have somewhat leaned into aspects or remnants of film
Mhm.
and would add aspects of that to their cameras. And in their T line of cameras, I think the T is supposed to stand for traditional, perhaps. Their digital T range was essentially designed to have a lot of dials and such on it that mimic more film cameras. And I think a lot of people, if you've seen more of a modern camera, they're pretty kind of rounded, have like maybe one dial that has like a bunch of letters on it, like A for automat, or I guess like there's an auto setting and
Mhm.
a
There's a
a shutter
flower
priority,
setting.
aperture. Yeah, like there are all these little dials. It's really trying to simplify things, and ultimately streamline the shooting process. But some of these Fujifilm cameras kind of stepped the opposite way and have a bunch of dials for very traditional photo things. Like there's a dial to select the shutter speed, there's a dial to change the ISO or like the film sensitivity or like the light sensitivity of the camera. And then there's also a physical dial to change the aperture that's on the lens themselves. And those are all things other than, I guess, the ISO, are all things that were on traditional film cameras. And when trying to jump into photography like this, I thought that sounded neat to me because I thought by having these dials to change these core elements of photography and like the quote unquote exposure triangle, I thought that might force me to learn the
And be more
process better.
mindful.
Yeah, and be more mindful of that process. And that's kind of why I selected it over, a more traditional or like Canon or Sony camera.
Mhm.
And I ultimately pleased to say that I think it did work. Did, I was a bit more mindful of photography and tried to learn more about the important things of getting an image exposed, like a proper exposure for images. So changing how long the shutter was open, the shutter speed, how much light was being let in through the aperture, which we talked a little bit about earlier, how most cell phone cameras have a fixed, really wide aperture, so you can't really change that. But then also change how sensitive the sensor is to light. And I think it has helped over the years working and trying to take photographs and thinking about those things has been helpful. But it also allows, you can also set any one of those settings to automatic and just control the aperture and let the camera decide the other things, which makes it easier to learn how some of the settings you're changing are affecting things.
Mhm.
With that said, I think one of the most important things about photography, and I guess anything, is just trying to do it, practice it. It's similar with painting. The more you try to paint and experiment with things, the better you're going to get at it. And I think the mindset going into photography, trying to learn it and not just let the camera decide everything for me with the dials and making it more front and center, really helped me approach the process, but
Mhm.
also trying to photograph different things really helped. Trying to photograph miniatures, but then also trying to photograph miniature stuff at events that I was going to, or like at try to photograph concerts, which the lighting is really poor, and all these things was really helpful throughout the whole process. And it was while trying to take pictures in different settings and recognizing, wow, the stuff I'm getting isn't what I want.
Mhm.
Like it allowed me to more naturally dip into more specific aspects of photography as it came up. And a
Yeah.
lot of these things that I learned kind of the hard way over time ultimately dealt with exposure and setting things up to make sure the camera is exposing your image properly. And ultimately, exposure is kind of the most important thing. You need to let in enough light to get the image to look natural, look like what you saw it or how you want it to look. If you let in too much and it's overexposed, things could look really washed out. Or let in like too little light, it's just too dark and you can't see anything.
Mhm.
But I feel there's a lot to learn in terms of exposure. And with point and shoot cameras and stuff that just determine all that for you won't always do it properly because the camera is trying its best to figure out what you want in a situation, but like
It
it
doesn't know.
isn't omnipotent. It doesn't know what you want. And understanding how the camera is determining what it thinks is a good exposure really helps. And that gets back to this idea that by phones making everything so automatic, it's good in a lot of senses, but if you don't understand what it's trying to do, it makes it harder to improve what you're doing. And in most cases, what the phone is trying to do, it's essentially trying to look at a scene and it kind of assumes that the stuff you're looking at is a neutral gray, like a gray card, and it's trying to get the scene as a whole to be neutral gray. And that, in a lot of cases, is fine. But if you're in a scene that's like a lot of white, a lot of snow, if you
Mm-hmm.
don't change the automatic settings a little bit to account for that, the camera will very likely try to expose it such that the snow is kind of dirty or grayish, or vice versa. If you're in like a concert or something and the stage is really dark and it's only the people up on stage are bright because of their skin or their flashy guitars or whatnot, it will often really, the camera will try to really overexpose things to try to get that all the black stage and stuff to make it gray, and it will result in the photo being very overexposed and washed out and look bad.
Yeah.
And most, like all cameras actually have, they have a light meter in there that is trying to read that lighting and predict what, how to properly expose it. But at least in digital cameras, like better cameras, like you can often change how that light meter is working. And a lot of old film cameras had a center weighted metering in which it would look, the light meter would essentially detect light in maybe the 60% of the center of the frame and try to adjust the exposure based on what's in the center of your camera, um, and try to get it to look like neutral gray. But some, they're like average metering, which will just average the entire screen and try to get metering. But then there's also, most cameras will have like a spot metering in which it will only, the light meter will only look at like a point, the center point of your screen that you're looking at. And that was sort of a revelation for me, because a lot of times in like taking pictures of miniatures in a battle scene or whatever, you want this cool, moody, dark photo with all these dark shadows and crevices and such, and just this gloomy figure in there. But if you don't change the metering mode and just leave it in like a center or averaging meter, it will, the camera will automatically essentially try to overexpose things such that everything is kind of lighter. But if you
Mm-hmm.
put it in a metering mode that just bases its exposure on the point you're pointing at, like you could just point it at the subject, the miniature, or the miniature's face, and it'll try to adjust the exposure such that that face looks exposed, but everything else is darker. And that really helped. So that would be one thing I would suggest if you're trying to look into using a digital camera better. Looking at the light meter modes or the photometry settings is incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
And just understanding that how the camera is working, it's trying to essentially make the scene look like neutral gray. And if you're in a really dark scene or a really light scene, the camera will likely do a bad job, and you need to adjust things to fit within that.
And I think particularly like if you're taking photos of miniatures and stuff, particularly on like a game board or something, oftentimes the lighting is really bad or not great, such that that then further exacerbates that problem, such that it's trying to make it such that you can pick out details essentially everywhere in the entire photo when you don't necessarily care about those.
Yeah, it's likely kind of the standard metering modes are usually like a center weighted or a average metering thing. It's, they're trying to get the whole scene to be neutral gray or well exposed, and in a lot of cases, you don't really want that. Um,
Yeah.
I guess at this point, so I've been talking a lot about the digital stuff and using my Fujifilm camera and such to take photos and phones and such, and me kind of slowly learning some of the things as I was with trial and error and whatnot. But as I mentioned, like I guess like a month or two ago, I got a few film cameras from our grandfather. One old German camera, Ihagi Exacta VX, which was made in 1955 or maybe 1956 in Dresden, Germany. It's like an old SLR camera with Carl Zeiss glass lenses, which they're still a very famous lens manufacturer today. But then also have got a Minolta SLR camera from Japan from early 80s. And getting some of these film cameras, it excited me for the prospect like, hey, it would be neat to step back, not just use this digital camera that had elements trying to replicate film and using the dials and such. It would be fun to actually try to use film itself. And yeah, it has been amazing. Partially just putting some of the stuff I've learned more to a test when there's less automation, as well as just learning some of the aspects of how film works and things like that. And all the film cameras I have are purely mechanical cameras, such that the shutter and all those things are all like kind of clockwork mechanical mechanisms. There aren't electronic things in there like a little circuit board that's releasing the shutter or controlling the light, things like that. And that overall, I think, is sort of fascinates me. Just all these little clockwork mechanisms that allow all this stuff to work and it won't fail eventually just due to some circuit board breaking over time. And that
Yeah.
has been fun. I guess some of the later ones like the Minolta, it does have a light meter in it through the viewfinder, and that uses a small battery, but you don't have to use the light meter at all, and otherwise the camera works completely mechanically without the battery. Um, but the light meters still help.
Well, so
But
one thing that I sort of have a question about that, and I think I largely know the answer to, but so there are tons of different types of like film stock and stuff, correct? And kind of each one has their own sort of like visual properties and stuff. Because like
mhm,
certainly only, well, this is only vaguely related. I know I've certainly heard tons of talk about people like certainly like talking about Golden Demon and stuff, and people complaining that the photographers there like, oh, they like didn't use the right color backdrop and all this other stuff, and like complaining that the photos are not representing the models well. And like I've certainly noticed that with say digital photography, that depending on how you take the photo or the lighting or how you edit it, it will certainly visually change what you're looking at, and they're not always an accurate representation of, say, like what my eye would see. And I know with looking at the film stocks and stuff you've experimented with, they certainly like each one has its own sort of almost like visual style to it, which I think is interesting. And it in it of itself can kind of almost like add to the art or the interest of it, where like
yeah,
you can
yeah.
kind of use that as an additional element to play up something that you're going for, whether it's using a film stock that's kind of in like sepia tones or like black and white. I
Mhm. No, that's true. And one thing before I even talk about the film stocks, that it is with digital photography, it is very easy like to do lots of post-production stuff, changing things around that won't necessarily be accurate to the miniature, which can be good or bad. But
well,
one thing that I
yeah.
think is important, particularly for sort of reference photos and stuff, it's really important that the white balance is correct, such that
Mm-hmm.
the the colors are actually like the colors you're taking, and depending on if you're taking a photo in lighting that's very warm, like l- um, warm tones, like on a lower Kelvin scale, like 3600 or whatever, as opposed to more like daylight,
Hmm.
5600, 6000 or something, that can really change the look of a photo. So having things properly white balanced, either through the camera, most cameras will have like an auto white balance and it tries to do it itself. But you can also, after taking it in post, if you can adjust it. And I that's something that I usually always do. And particularly because most of the time, if I'm not taking like a picture of a scene and it's just a picture of a miniature, I will usually have it on a neutral gray background. And
Hmm.
since neutral gray is what the camera's trying to expose stuff with, and it's essentially how white balancing will work, you can just use that gray
As a
as
reference.
the color for the white balance, and it will adjust it to make it more accurate to what you're shooting.
Well,
So
so I
that
would say
can
related to this whole aspect, I know we went to Adepticon this year, and like I looked at a lot of Golden Demon entries, and like a lot of these models were ones that I have seen pictures of these models on Instagram from lots of different painters and stuff. And I in some regards was often sort of surprised or shocked how different a lot of the models looked in person compared to like the photos and stuff I would see online. Oftentimes, like the colors are don't even get close to representing like what the actual model looks like sitting like on a shelf or something. And the same thing was true in terms of like colors, even the not necessarily the textures, but like oftentimes, like I know some painters will have a lot of the paints and stuff they use are very matte, and then they will try and paint light reflections and stuff on to like give them an impression of like a type of material
volume and such.
and volume and stuff. And oftentimes, depending on how that's done, if you look at that in person compared to like a photograph, they look very different. And I think that has gotten me to think a little bit more about taking photographs and stuff. And at least for where I'm sitting, I often want to try and strive to make the photograph be as accurate to how I visualize it in person. But depending on what
Yeah,
you're
I found
trying to do,
yeah.
like if you're trying to create like a scene or tell a story or something with a photo, you might not really even want that. And I guess that's
I
just
feel a
another
lot of
thing to work on.
I agree that a lot of the miniatures would be much more matte, whereas like the photos you'd see online, like it almost like the contrast was ratcheted up a little bit, or like the darker darks were really pulled down such that they would look completely black, whereas
Yeah.
in person, since they were so matte, the blacks wouldn't look as dark because they're
Yeah.
so matte, and that is kind of interesting, and it is easy with all the editing tools to kind of make things that maybe aren't quite as accurate as they would actually be.
Yeah.
But I guess to get back to the film stocks, that is an interesting thing. There are a lot of different film stocks, and unlike for digital, you can take the photo and just kind of change it to your heart's content, particularly if you're shooting in a raw format as opposed to a JPEG where they kind of bake in a bunch of the settings. But um, for film, like you're quote unquote limited by the chemistry of like the emulsions and such used in
Mhm.
chemical mixtures to make this stuff work, as well as, and this is kind of a, when talking about exposure in cameras, it's like the exposure triangle with the shutter speed and the aperture, but the other one is the ISO. And I guess naively didn't, which the ISO is again the like the sensor's sensitivity to light, and I kind of sadly didn't quite realize that for film like that is coming directly from film, in which you
Hmm.
can't change the ISO between pictures or change the film sensitivity. It is literally based on the roll of film you load into the camera. It has a particular ISO or a particular light sensitivity. And when you load that roll of film, like you have to completely shoot that roll of film and change to a new one if ever you want to change the ISO.
Hmm.
So like you have to be particular in knowing like I'm going to try to go shoot this thing or that. You have to make a decision like what type of film stock do you want to use? How sensitive do you want it to be to light? And similar to when people talk about digital setting, people often say you want to keep the ISO as low as possible because as you raise the ISO, make it more sensitive to light, you can start to introduce grain or film graininess to the photos. And that is similar to the ISO in like the actual film stocks themselves. If you have a high ISO, like an 800 speed stuff, it is very sensitive to light and will work better in darker conditions, but will tend to have a bit more grain to it. Whereas if you have like archiving stuff that has a low ISO of like an ISO of 100, it tends to have much less grain but is much darker. Hey, tabletop minions, nice to see you here. Yeah, the photo that's on screen there was actually taken from um yeah, the photo we have a photo I guess on screen here of a one of our cultists, a black and white photo was actually taken on this exact camera from 1955 from Dresden, Germany. um, in a Kodak Tri-X ISO 400 film stock. So 400, I think now is kind of a very standard film stock that works relatively well in all conditions. It lets enough light in for somewhat lower light sensitivities, but then um, will kind of work well in all situations. Whereas if you have a lower ISO film stock like ISO 100, it's nice in that it has very little film grain, but if it's a really dark scene, you might not be able to adjust the shutter speed or ISO enough that it actually turns out. But, and then as Adam, you mentioned, different film stocks, they kind of have different sort of profiles and looks to them.
Yeah.
Portra is a Kodak film stock that people really like for portraits and other things. It kind of has a slight pastel look to it that is
Hmm.
kind of people think about vintage photos and such. So
Yeah.
some of taking film photos can be just choosing out a film stock that is good for what you're trying to do. Like I think Kodak Ektar is an ISO 100 stock, so like isn't great in low light, but people often like to use it for landscapes and settings with like uh, plants and stuff in them. And I'm actually trying one of those in one of my cameras out at the moment. We'll see what it turns out to look like, but it has been really fun using different film stocks and trying to incorporate some of my digital knowledge into this and not not having like a digital screen on the back to immediately be able to look at it. Is the exposure right? Is it overexposed? Is the framing right? While more difficult, it has been kind of great to make me be more to slow down a little bit and be more particular with what I'm doing. And that has been nice. Like to think about what's in the frame, what the exposure settings are, like how wide or open the aperture is, or how close it in for like what's going to be in focus. And it has just made me more mindful of what I'm doing. But it is still harder like that. And I think doing any like kind of a event photography at like Adepticon or something like that, well, I could see still bringing a film camera to have fun with the process, like to truly document something. Like I'll still be sticking with digital because you can just take many more photos more quickly, um, and then also check to see that you got the shot you want to get, and not just pray you did it right and didn't, I don't know, do something stupid like not set up the, like when you load a film into a camera and it has a light meter, you have to change a little dial to let the
Yeah.
camera know what the sensitivity is. And if you don't, it'll expose it wrong. And if you don't, then have the developer push it or whatnot, it might not turn out well and whatnot. So digital is still kind of, is still obviously the future, but film has been fun as well. The the model that we were showing a picture of was actually a conversion, Adam, you did with a Warcry, what is it, like Scions of the Flame model?
Yeah, it was
Like
one
a
of, I think that's what
Chaos
they were
Cultist.
called. Like, was pretty heavily converted um from that model, but if you look at those Scion of Flames models, it'll be pretty easy to pick out which one this was modified off of. But
Just 40Kified a little bit.
yeah.
but but yeah, I've just been amazed. Like film has just gotten me excited about taking photos again, and it is even just excited me to be more particular with the digital photos that I'm taking as well. And that has just been really fun. And I think anyone trying to take better photos, the more mindful you are in what you're doing really helps. And I think anyone can become a much better photographer by just being a little bit more thoughtful of it. Like you can certainly, as I mentioned earlier, the phone cameras have really high megapixels, so you can crop stuff out to your heart's content and it will probably look okay. But
Hmm.
slowing down a little bit and trying to think about what's in the scene before you take the picture, oftentimes I find results in a better picture overall. Like thinking about what's in there can be really nice, at least particularly if you have the time to do it. There's certainly something to be said about at an event, or if you're taking a picture of a bird or something like
Also,
sports or anything like that. You might not have that luxury, but
yeah. Also, another thing that I think I've only more recently become more aware of this, mostly due to like Eric, your increased interest in photography. Like, I know when I got like a nicer, this is a Panasonic camera, like the notion that you could, it had a means where you could actually change the lens you were using. Like I thought like, whoa, that's cool, that's interesting. And I think it's now become increasingly apparent that, as Eric you mentioned, that photography can be a very specialized thing depending on what you're trying to take a photo of. Chances are there is a lens that was designed for something very similar to what that application is. And certainly, you were saying with the cell phone cameras and stuff, it often works better if you take a picture further away and crop everything out. But then, in that sense, you're not really taking advantage of all those megapixels. So, like the notion, like, you know what, I bet there is a lens where I could fill up the whole thing with what I'm interested in and maintain all of that. There certainly
no, that
is.
is very true. And I think because of working with some of these film cameras, it's very, in a lot of cases, very easy to like go on eBay and get a lot of different focal lengths for relatively inexpensive, like $100 for like a professional grade Nikon lens. And it has allowed me to try a lot more lenses than I had for just the digital Fujifilm camera I've had. And that has been really nice because it has allowed me to um, use just different lenses and see what the different focal lengths are without like, oh, well, I should spend $700 to get this lens and hopefully it works out for what I want. And admittedly,
Yeah.
YouTube is a wonderful resource um, to like learn about some of these things, but I feel miniature photography is somewhat of a niche thing. In
Hmm.
most of the photography channels you're going to listen to or find aren't going to be talking about that. They'll be talking about portraiture or landscape or
I feel
like
the
like
may
wedding
yeah.
photography, which isn't necessarily what we're trying to
What
do.
what you should do is you should go on Instagram and find professional photographers of like insects and other tiny things. Like they could probably give you a lot of pointers.
Yeah, so macro photographers is certainly better. And having been able to use some old like macro lenses has been really nice for miniature photography. Um, and towards that end, if you have old film lenses that you've gotten from like a parent or a grandfather or something, most of those you can adapt with like a simple cheap adapter and adapt those lenses to your digital camera and use them. And I've done that with the Fujifilm camera. I've adapted an old Nikkor macro lens and like a larger telephoto lens, and that's can be a kind of fun way to experiment with different focal lengths and get some interesting like vintage character from lenses on your digital camera and not have to deal with film itself, which is kind of neat.
Hmm.
So something that people could consider looking into, that you can get a lot of life from other lenses. But yeah, uh tabletop minions there, yeah. There is something that can be said about macro lenses. If you
You
get
can't
too
hide
close, like,
anything.
yeah, no, you can really see all the textures and mistakes. So, and also there's the idea that the closer you get to something, which I mentioned earlier, the more shallow the depth of field is. So that can also cause issues that while you can really fill up the frame of the camera, it might be the depth of field may be so shallow that like nothing's in focus and you have to focus stack things, take a bunch of photos, which that adds a whole other level of difficulty. But I've found that having like a somewhat longer telephoto, like 60 to 100 macro lens, you don't necessarily have to get so close that you have the true macro one-to-one
Hmm.
magnification on the lens to get a nice photo. Like you can be back a little bit and maybe not get that true macro magnification, but still get a nice image, still have like the aperture closed down a bit to get more of it in focus and get a nice image. But having the macro capability and the ability to focus closer, I think just gives you more flexibility in taking a photo. I recently got a um what is a 30 millimeter macro lens for my Fujifilm camera, which based on since it's a crop APS-C sensor, it's kind of like a 45 millimeter equivalent lens. So it's kind of a nice walk around focal length. But since it's a macro, you can get really close, and it just adds a lot of nice flexibility that you can get super close, but you don't have to, and can still get very nice images and fill up most of the sensor and not have to just crop out 90% of the photo. And that has
Yeah.
been nice. But I feel like I mentioned some of these particulars until you really get into the craft, it can be difficult to learn and isn't stuff that you'll necessarily easily pull out from like an internet article or a YouTube video unless you really know what to look for. And that's difficult to appreciate when you're just getting into it. So, but
I like,
it's really fun to do.
yeah. Well, I particularly like the introduction of this, like some of these newer lenses to see like hyper detailed views of whatever it is you're looking at, because like honestly, like I've really taken to using that as a means for, at least when I'm painting, to figure out areas where I can improve things.
Yeah, no, it does help. But one thing that I guess could be said, if you are doing like macro stuff and or have a really shallow depth of field, most cameras do have like sort of a photo stacking bracketing thing built into them that you can, if you put the camera on a tripod, you can set
Hmm.
a focus point like in front of the model and then one behind the model, and it will kind of calculate how many shots it needs to take and take a series of photos, kind of zooming in slowly. And then you can use like Photoshop or Lightroom or Helicon Focus or something to digitally merge that stuff together and get around the fact that maybe the physics of the lenses aren't working perfectly for what you're trying to do. With that said, I've found for some of the miniature photography stuff that I've tried to do that, sometimes in a scene, if there's not like enough contrast between the miniature and like the gray, dull 40K background, the computer can have trouble sort of separating the subject from that background, and it can result in like a haze around the miniature. So I don't know. Your mileage may vary with that, but it's still fun to play around with, I think. But I guess towards that end, I found the thing that I tend to like better and not having to do all this focus stacking is just taking a single picture in which I close down the aperture a bunch such that more is in focus. You need a lot more light to do that, but if you have your camera on a tripod, it's easier to do that. You can have some nice
Hmm.
lights that maybe you use for painting or something and still get enough light to get a good picture that has most of the miniature in focus. Um,
Yeah.
but towards that end, like everything, there's still always compromises there. That if you close the sensor down too much, a lot of lenses they may not have been optimized for that, and you'll start to get like um, diffraction issues and stuff that it might not be as sharp. So, as with everything, there pluses and minuses about them. But yeah, so I guess with all this, I've been maybe yammering on about this a lot, but photography is fun. It's cool. I think I would encourage anyone to look into it a little bit more, as it's great to be able to share the miniatures and stuff you're doing and with the world and other people, and it can kind of encourage you to get better both at photography and converting and painting miniatures. So I would, yeah, strongly encourage it. And even just using your cell phone, you can take amazing pictures, particularly if you start to learn a little bit more about how it's taking them and can be more purposeful about what you're doing and
How you're
things like,
composing the photos and
yeah, and not being afraid to crop your photos to get rid of maybe some perspective distortion and stuff like that.
yeah.
But I guess with that, thanks everybody for listening to this episode of the podcast, and we will talk to you again soon. All right, well, we're going to edit some of this stuff into an episode of our podcast dragged into Turbo Lasers, but um, we can probably keep chatting a little bit here towards that end, Moss Dog 24, we do some stuff with Age of Sigmar. Admittedly, I feel most of the fantasy stuff we're more interested in is probably Mordheim. Like the old world, the very Blanchian stuff.
That's
But
fair. Yeah.
I think that is more in line with the stuff we enjoy, which I mean, I guess there are a lot of cool Age of Sigmar stuff, particularly if it's more towards the, I don't know, darker, weirder elements of them.
Hmm.
Which sadly, the miniature that Tabletop Minions was talking about that Adam you converted, like they're gonna stop selling that model soon because most
Oh
of the
yeah, like a lot
Warcry
of the Warcry
models,
range, I think they've
they're
already gotten
stopping.
rid of it.
Yeah, they may have already, which that's kind of sad. Like that, I think was the cool aspect of Age of Sigmar that,
Yeah,
or
I think
Warcry specifically in Age of Sigmar, that it spent this time to develop chaos cultists and the diversity that can be had there.
yeah, I honestly think some of the Warcry warbands and stuff had some of the nicest model ranges and stuff, and they were certainly really nice. At least some of anyway were really nice for serving as a foundation for all manner of conversions. Sort of like a lot of the Blood Bowl teams and stuff. You certainly see a lot of the elves, like Dark Elves, High Elves, and stuff. A lot of those models and to find their way into conversions and stuff, just because for the most part they're often sort of nice
Hmm.
poses, open hands, etc., that can be built upon to make all manner of things. But they're
Yeah.
gone.
Oh, freelance. It's exciting to hear that you're thinking about picking up and painting some models and such. Um, yeah, there's certainly nothing wrong with just painting models. Like you don't have to have some mindset of wanting to play a game or anything. Because admittedly, we don't play many of the games. We're much more focused on
Honestly, in
building and
terms
painting
of,
miniatures.
you should just try and stick with whatever you think looks cool and is interesting, because like ultimately this is a something like you're hoping to do for your own enjoyment and stuff, so like that's often what I would stick towards.
And also, like there are so many lines of like paint, for example, hobby tools, glue, stuff like that. And for all practical purposes, virtually all the paint is pretty good now. There are certainly
Yeah.
differences, and some lines have maybe slightly better reds or whites or things of that nature. But by and large, they're all quite good. And like I wouldn't be too concerned about, oh, did you get the perfect few starting paints, or is your brush the perfect brush? Like, oh, I need Winsor Newton brush, or just use a GW brush. Like, they're all fine. You'll, as you do it more and more, maybe you'll, develop your own preferences and stuff. But I wouldn't be overly concerned or precious about that stuff. Just try to get into it and enjoy it. The stuff will come as you go. Like you'll get better at building and putting together miniatures and painting
Yeah.
them and being more expressive and exploratory in how you paint them and all that stuff. But, that all comes in time and is part of, I think, the fun of the whole process. So
Yeah.
it can be very easy to fall into like this gear acquisition syndrome. Like, oh, I should get an airbrush and I need to get the best airbrush. And what are the best paints and what are the best this or that? And I don't know. That isn't always necessarily the best. Like you can get good results and have a great time without going wild with that.
Yeah, like
And
Having
often.
said that, I'm certainly guilty of buying too many paints and too many miniatures and all that stuff. Like it's in some senses also kind of a fun aspect of it, but
I
I wouldn't be discouraged about it.
I might also say maybe don't worry too much about the potential of ruining a model based on a paint job you're not satisfied with. 'Cause everybody has to start somewhere, and it's probably better that you're actually painting and doing something than keeping away from it because you're afraid you're gonna mess something up.
Yeah, that is very true. Partially because it's very easy to strip a model and repaint it or just paint over something. Most of how paints are formulated in now, and like there's so many resources and how to do it and thinning your paints and such. It's easy to repaint something over top of it, and it'll probably be fine. You will not have put in such a thick layer that you've obscured things. And also, I think like if you're excited about doing this stuff, you probably do have some attention to detail and like are interested in trying to do this well or that. Like you'll almost certainly do a better job than you anticipate. And
Yeah.
just being excited about that, I think makes it easier to do better and want to try more. And like it's also fun to have this a documentation of where you started and where you end up. So
Yeah.
keeping those original models as sort of a marker of where you started and how much you've improved and changed over time and what's exciting to you now, I think is fun. And that is potentially another reason why starting like an Instagram account for your hobby stuff is something you could consider, just to have a place to put pictures of the stuff you're doing so other people can see it and
And even if
comment.
it's
And
just for you to kind of keep a record of what you're
yeah,
interested in or working on.
no, it's true. It's true. And yeah, spend some time with your phone to take cool photos and learn the process and get better, because photography is certainly kind of a related hobby that can be very rewarding too.
It's fair. Yeah. And I know certainly with like the advent of Instagram and other forms of social media, now that has made a very easy way to relate and interface with other people. And oftentimes, if you have like your own models up on Instagram or another similar thing, it makes other people more willing and interested to like sort of interface with you and chat with you about stuff. Because I certainly know I've people have sent me like private messages and stuff on Instagram, and almost like the first thing I always do is like go to their Instagram page and kind of try to see and get a sense of like what they're interested in or working on so I can have a better sense
Mhm.
of
Yeah, and
where they're
towards that
coming
end,
from.
Instagram and just this hobby as a whole, people, at least from my experience, are very willing to share and excited that you are excited about the hobby. So really, I would encourage you to send like a message, private message to somebody that's doing stuff you like. Ask how they achieved some particular painting style or something. People I've found in this hobby are very excited to share, and yeah, just be excited that you're excited about their things. So, I mean, honestly, the worst that could happen probably is that they just don't respond. And, the way a lot of these social media platforms change over time, it can be easy to like not even realize someone sent you a message. So, I wouldn't take stuff personally, but by and large, I think people are very willing and excited to share. Oh, that's amazing. If you are a photographer, that's really cool. Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot to learn there. And so yeah, I have never used a tilt shift lens, but I know Fujifilm recently released a tilt shift lens, I think, for their medium format line of cameras and such. But
What's
having
medium format?
So medium format is essentially just a larger format, and that all of that is largely based on film days. The
Mm-hmm.
standard type of film was 35 millimeter film, and
Okay,
that was
okay.
it was the size of the film and what an image would look like on the exposed film. But then there's 120 film, which is just a lot larger, and that film, rather than being like 35 millimeters, they would tend to be like 60 by 60 millimeters, like
Okay,
just
yeah,
a lot bigger, and a bigger frame would allow, more detail, more all that sort of stuff. And when they started to make digital stuff, a lot of, I think, the original ones were the sensor size was the size of a 35 millimeter
I see. Yeah.
uh,
Okay.
frame of film. But then companies have since made digital sensors that are bigger, and
Mm-hmm.
they just call them also medium format cameras. So a lot of them, like I know some of the GFX ones that Fujifilm makes, they're like 100 megapixel sensors, whereas most, or I would say in general, most full
So
frame camera sensors are between 25 and 60 megapixels, but these bigger medium format ones are much higher megapixels, and as a result, they're even better for cropping stuff.
So this is sort of maybe a very ignorant question, but I know for like microscopy and stuff, like a lot of the cameras and detectors they use for that, like particularly for like electron microscopy, they have like when you're using the camera, the detector, they have different modes. Like they have what they call a super resolution mode, where like
Hmm.
every pixel on the detector, instead of just um being like a single pixel, they will partition that pixel into like four quadrants to try and more accurately represent where that, in this case, electron or photon of light, like actually hit
Hmm.
the detector to like hopefully get a more accurate representation of what it is you're viewing. And like I guess I just don't know enough about like the sensors and stuff in cameras to know if is something like that a thing or not really.
I think it is. I know. I mean, I'm not very knowledgeable on this. I know they make stacked sensors, like 45 megapixel and various stacked sensors, perhaps.
Okay.
I mean, there's some engineering thing going in there to make them
Yeah.
better. And I know they also have these like pixel shift sensors that I think perhaps do something perhaps akin to that, to try to, even though maybe the sensor is 25 megapixels, but it can do
Hmm.
something with the pixels to end up making like a 100 megapixel image, provided it's on a tripod or something. But quite the
Okay. Yeah.
engineering and technical feats that allow this, I'm not
Well, maybe that's another thing to
really
look
sure.
into on another day.
Yeah,
um.
so much stuff to get into it. But it's really cool freelance that you're actually a photographer. Like that's a lot of technical knowledge and know-how that will serve you well for
It
um
will.
showing off the miniatures and stuff you're doing. And I know I would have loved to have more knowledge of that starting out this process, but I feel I've slowly been getting there, and it's been fun to um learn the process more and be able to do a better job of it. Yeah, no, books and other references certainly help a lot. Now, it's like I have watched lots of YouTube videos. Um, Admittedly, for this um exacta camera from the 50s, I have a old book that was published about exacta cameras and how
That's
to
great.
best use them and such, that I've reviewed and used in some of their old manuals and such, which is kind of fun to dive back into that and read these older
Printed
books
media
and
for
stuff.
learning things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Because it, like, photography is a relatively old craft, and like all the basic things of it, the physics and how they've, like, ISO, shutter speed, how f stops are calculated, and the meaning of that, like, that stuff hasn't really changed hugely
Yeah.
over time. I guess ISO used to be called something different, but
Who knew? I
ASA, I
didn't.
think. Yeah, but um, as with everything, painting, miniatures, photography, like, you can dive really deep into them, and there's like lots of stuff you could learn, but it if you approach it slowly and are excited about it, I think it can be really fun.
Yeah, and I
But with a
think
lot of the stuff, the more you can merge different interests together, the better.
yeah, and I think again trying to focus on what you're interested in and kind of what you enjoy doing. I think Instagram and other things like that have sort of made it more apparent, at least to like me, and I think a lot of people, that sort of whatever you're interested in, whatever specific thing you're interested in, you can probably find other people who are also interested in that. And it's neat to sort of talk with them and get a sense of like, oh, there are people that like this very specialized thing, and like, oh, this one's in Finland or this person's in wherever, and that I think is also kind of fun.
Yeah, the world can be a surprisingly small place.
Yeah. No, Eric, you've now
Yeah,
gotten
film
a
is
better
so
sense of
yeah,
cost
film
with
is very interesting. Like, having started in digital and gone into film a little bit now, like, it's interesting how, like, there aren't all these modes. Like, you can change the aperture and the shutter speed, and you put in the roll of film, and that determines the ISO, and there's nothing else. Like, there aren't all these photometry modes. Like, if you have a light meter, it's always the same. Maybe it's center weighted, and that's it. And like,
Mhm.
there aren't all these things to distract you, and you can just focus on the basic craft of photography, which is kind of fun. In a lot of digital cameras, I know certainly the Fuji X-T4 I have done most of my stuff with. It is very overwhelming, all these dials, and like, I don't know what any of this does. Like, I don't know what all these modes are and all these things, and it's very powerful, and like, you have a lot of things you can do, but it's almost too much. And with a film camera, I guess there's some of the, like, the later ones that have more automated what stuff, but a lot of them, like, there is just a lot less dials and things to actually do, and that is kind of refreshing. Oh, you have an XT5. That's fun. Yeah, I got an XT4 initially because I thought since it had all the dials, it would force me to be more mindful of learning the exposure triangle and stuff. And I think that has helped. But then recently getting into film, it's been fun to kind of be forced to put some of that to use with film. But
Yeah,
as you said, it's, while maybe the cameras are, a lot of them are relatively cheap to get, and vintage lenses are somewhat cheap. Um, have Developing the film can take a while, and it's fairly costly. And like, you obviously can't tell if the stuff you did was good until that happens. So um, it can be difficult in that way to learn, but it's still cool. And I've been using my XT4 and an old Nikon macro lens to scan the negatives and convert them and such in Lightroom. So that cuts the cost down a little bit, I guess. But um, then you have to do all that and learn all that editing and such. So I don't know. There's always some place you can put your time and effort and something new to learn. But
that's true.
Yeah, it's fun though. But I really like the XT4. I mean, its autofocus stuff is maybe not the best, like, but taking pictures of miniatures, that's not that important.
Yeah.
Well, with that, maybe we've been going on for a little while here. Maybe we should call this to a close soon.
Yeah, no, it's already past. It's
I
past midnight
need
here.
to
I have
go
to
to
get up
bed.
tomorrow at 6.
But yeah, no, I hear that on film. Yeah, a lot of the stuff. If I want to make sure it's good, I will take a bunch of photos, maybe adjust the some of the settings, shutter
Surely I got it
speed,
one of them right. Yeah.
whatnot, or the aperture a little bit to make sure it's okay. I mean, they do have usually a depth of field preview button that can help with that, but it's still you're never 100% sure until you get the
Yeah.
negatives, the develop negatives back.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you everybody, and thanks for listening and asking questions and being involved. And
Yeah, and I
yeah,
guess
enjoy the
the
hobby.
yeah, and the episode of our podcast Dragged into Turbolasers that we recorded tonight will hopefully be up on our blog between the Bolter and me, hopefully in a few days.
Yeah, I'll edit some of the stuff and make it a little bit more listenable, hopefully. Talking
Yeah.
about photography and our journey through that with miniatures and such. But
Yeah. But yeah,
yeah, thanks
thanks
everybody.
everybody for joining us tonight, listening and asking questions and engaging. Um, keep on enjoying the hobby. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will talk to you again soon. Till next time,
Yep.
over
See
and
you
out,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.